Hello. The 1.5 event has concluded, which means that it's about that time where we go over the events of the event, right? Now I'm going to try to keep this video a little bit briefer, primarily because in terms of overall story and thematic relevance, Uluru isn't super huge, right? It's a story about Arcanists having their Olympics, essentially.
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
Now, there are ideas and concepts that are relevant to the world building and overarching story of Verse 1999, but for the most part, it's a pretty straightforward story. So there shouldn't be too much to talk about. I'll try to touch on the major points, and that's about it. I do kind of hesitate to call the event fluff, but it definitely lacks the gravitas of the 1.4 update, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, right? Because 1.4 was kind of heavy. There was a lot of information that got dumped on us there, so a event where we get to like decompress, I think, is nice. But with that, let's go ahead and just get started and take a look at 1.5, yeah? So Uluru Festival takes place in around the 90s, which means this is going to be taking place after Chapter 5. This is going to be taking place after Apeiron, all of that. And we begin with Vertin and Medicine Pocket wandering the streets of Australia looking for a certain bookstore. Medicine Pocket is here because they want a medical text that, for the time being, is not terribly important for us. It is expounded on later on in Ezra's side story. For the main plot, it's not important. Now, the two are lost, and they decide to ask someone for directions, and they ask a young girl who is jogging on the street, who we find out is Spathodea. Now, Spathodea is going to be our primary protagonist for this event, and she helps him out, shows him where to go, and then rushes off and winds up colliding with one of our secondary protagonists, Desert Flannel. And this seems to be the, I guess, catalyst for the events, right? Because upon colliding with Desert Flannel, this seems to awaken something in Spathodea. She becomes disoriented, she confused, her pulse becomes weak, and eventually she passes out. With Vertin saying that they probably should take her to Laplace to have her checked. However, later on, Spathodea wakes up in her room, having opted to not go with Vertin and decide to basically just sleep it off. And when she wakes up, she is wildly thirsty. Almost like she hasn't drunk anything in a long while. She drinks iced tea, she drinks hot water, she winds up with nausea, stomach pain, and then in order to distract herself from this discomfort, begins to look over an album of collected photos of Arcanist athletes from past Uluru games. As she is reading this, something strange begins to happen, right? She begins to reminisce about the games in the past that she had attended, right? She says stuff like, I wish I could see the Uluru Stadium with my own eyes again, even for a minute, or how I used to host the opening ceremonies. And it's at this point that she begins to realize that something is a little bit off. These are memories that she has, but she does not actually recall experiencing. Her memories basically are kind of muddled. She doesn't really get it, right? And it's at this point that a warmth begins to rise from her stomach to her chest, as if there's a heat that is just traveling up her gut, up to her throat, and eventually she throws up a flame, which she holds in her hands. And the chapter ends with her saying, I never knew we were descended from the Red Dragon. The Red Dragon is referenced many times, 2 or 3 times in this event, right? It is never explained. We don't know what exactly the Red Dragon is. From the way it is mentioned in the text, it seems to be a very specific thing, whether this is literally a red dragon or the sobriquet of a person, we don't know. But that is Chapter 1. Chapter 2 opens in a Laplace facility with Vertin, Spathodea, and Desert Flannel all gathered together. And it's here that we learn that upon impacting with Desert Flannel a little earlier in the day, Spathodea had been unconscious for around 17 minutes. Now, upon giving Vertin a list of all her ailments, She asks if Spathodia is related to the Red Dragon. Again, no details on this. We just get the name drop and that's it. Now Spathodia answers in the negative, saying that she had checked all family records and that she had phoned her parents, and the possibility of any relation or connection there is basically zero. Now Desert Flannel is also here, and she does not believe Spathodia at all. She thinks that she is faking it, that the flame is somehow fabricated. She doesn't believe a single word of it, and it's here that we learn that these two actually know each other. They have been acquainted before this whole incident went down, with Spathodia saying that they are neighbors, and Desert Flannel countering, saying that they live 3 streets away. And it's here that we learn that Spathodia comes from a family of immigrants who live in the more well-to-do area of the neighborhood, while Desert Flannel lives basically in a more run-down area, where she's basically taking up a whole lot of side jobs and anything she can to make ends meet. So they're kind of butting heads here. Burton kind of breaks up the little fight they're having, asking for more details, and we learn that memories continue to flash in Spathodia's head. Sometimes she remembers things from the past, of crowds that had worshipped her, of running in the Uluru Stadium, and then sometimes she just remembers things that happened in the present. And it's at this point that we segue to Chapter 3, where Medpoc enters and is going through over Spathodia's files, and while doing this they find something odd and they go off to fetch somebody. Medicine Pocket then comes back, bringing a small child along with him, who is going to be our deuteragonist for the event, Ezra, claiming that Ezra is the most suited for Spathodia's case. We find out that Ezra is a mycologist, and that he is actually a human, not an arcanist. The latter of which Spathodia seems to be taken aback, and this is going to foreshadow one of the main themes, the main conflicts that run throughout the length of the event, which is a conflict between Spathodia and Ezra regarding their lineages, essentially. So after fussing around a little bit, they finally get down to business, and Ezra reads off of Spathodia's file. The flame that she had spat out has a core that is obsidian, to which they have dated back to thousands of years. And then it's at this point that he drops the bomb that Spathodia is a reincarnator. Now, it's exactly what it sounds like, right? It is a arcanist lineage that is apparently very, very rare, that upon someone's death, they will essentially be reborn as someone else at some indeterminate time in the future. And that the memories that Spathodia are seeing are not illusions, but rather they are recollections of a past life. And that after a period of turmoil in which her memories become all jumbled, her personality should eventually settle on that of her past self. And we get this idea that maybe the Spathodia that we know now is not necessarily going to be the one that it settles down upon. The story touches on this idea a little bit, but it kind of hand waves it away, so we're not going to linger on that for too long. Now, we get a little bit of the logistics of reincarnation and some vague ideas of the arcanist's idea of metaphysics, right? Where Ezra explains that the soul, which is considered to be the essence of a person, is, upon death, returned to a circulating network. That the world exists as a vast, invisible net upon which our lives are points upon, and a reincarnator is someone who, at point A, disappears and shows up at point B in basically a different skin, and the reason behind this is still unknown. Ezra likens reincarnators to fungi, in which they would spread their mycelium underground beneath the network, and at random points in the network, fruiting bodies pop up. So this idea that it's all one organism, however, iterations of it will randomly appear on the timeline. That's basically how they explain a reincarnator. And it's at this point that Ezra, well, he started to show a little bit of, I guess, the human bias, right? He talks about how Spathadia is acting maybe a little bit hysterical, and it's a result of her arcanist nature. And of course, this kind of riles Spathadia up, who gets angry and says that she hates how humans are always kind of classifying arcanists, how that they're always saying they're kind of over emotional, they have all of these tendencies that, I mean, at this point she is kind of proving, right? Because at this point her anger causes the clinic to catch fire. Everything is set ablaze, and when Laplace faculty comes to help extinguish the flames, Spathadia suddenly feels threatened. She feels that these flames are important to her, and that if they attempt to put them out, she will lose something that she doesn't necessarily want to lose, and it's to this end that she resists arrest. We fight off the staff, and upon defeating them, they just give Spathadia a fireproof box, saying that they know there's no use in trying to reason with an arcanist, essentially, and that they might as well just go along with their whims and attempt to mitigate whatever damage comes. So they give her a box in which she places the flame, and it's at this point that the flame actually speaks to her. She hears words emanating from it in her mind. Trying to get more information from the flame, Spathadia tries to communicate a little bit harder with it. She hears the words that they must go back to the Uluru games, and the flame then merges with her, and she becomes this kind of hybrid thing where she's just sort of on fire. Chapter 4 jumps to the point of view of Vertin and Ezra and Desert Flannel, who have left the hospital and are outside now, giving Spathadia some alone time, essentially, right? They talk about some generally unimportant stuff, and they are eventually interrupted by a sudden blaze, right? And they find that Spathadia has escaped her confinement and is now standing before them, seemingly having merged with the flame. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say that I think this design is very, very cool. I wish they had kept it for her high too, or at least had given it to her as a skin or something. Maybe one day in the future, who knows? It looks very cool. I like it a lot. Regardless, Spathadia keeps yapping about sportsmanship and the games and just all sorts of things that don't really make sense. And it's pretty clear that she's kind of delirious at this point. She's not really in her right mind, so we beat her up and bring her back to our senses. To which she says, we must revive the Uluru games. And it's at this point that we meet what I guess you could call our antagonist of the story. And I use that word very, very loosely, because while he does appear to throw a wrench in the plans, he does not seem to have a whole lot of significance. I'm going to be honest with you. Like, in terms of like thematics and plot, he seems very much more like an afterthought than anything else. He is there as a nuisance more than anything. He does play a little bit of a role later on, but for the 90% of the story, you kind of forget he's there until he shows up again. Right? So Macaur is just this dude who is apparently acquainted with Desert Flannel. He's kind of her arch nemesis, and is trying to defame her for some slight that we do not know about just yet. And he's apparently taken pictures of this whole shindig that's gone down, in which we are all kind of caught in this compromising position where we fought, and all sorts of stuff, right? It's a position that Desert Flannel does not want to be seen in, and now Macaur has blackmail material on her and is disseminating it to the newspaper sites and what have you. We then go on to chapter 5, which also happens to be the next day, right? Desert Flannel goes up to a newsstand only to find that the previous night's fiasco has made it to the headlines. and now she is both deeply embarrassed and also in danger of losing her positions of employment. And it's to this end that she notices that a box full of what appear to be tickets have been left with the newsstand owner, who she is somewhat well acquainted with. The owner claims that these tickets were dropped off and that they were to be the entry fee for the recently announced revival of the games, to which Desert Funnel recognizes that this is inaccurate. It is not factual. Yeah. She recognizes that this is the handiwork of the local gangs and decides, you know what, she's going to take a page out of their book. If these games are going to happen, she might as well be the one making money off of it, so she takes the tickets and resolves to sell them. However, we find that this is actually all a ruse. McCower shows up, and apparently he had arranged for these tickets to be shown to her so that she gets this idea to sell them off, to start the games, all of that good stuff. So he is basically kind of pulling the strings behind this whole thing. We also become acquainted with this idea of the bunyip, which is a critter that apparently feeds off of rumors and gossip and whatnot, and kind of grow and mature off of them. And it seems that McCower is somewhat in league with them, though to what degree we're not entirely sure of just yet. We then switch our perspective over to Spathadia and Ezra. Now, Spathadia wants to be discharged. She has work to do, the games need to happen. However, Ezra is rather leery about the idea of letting her out so soon. She is still, her Arcanum has just manifested. She is still in this period of instability, to which he says it could take 4 to 12 weeks for the symptoms to settle down, and this is far too long for Spathadia. She needs to have the games happen ASAP before the summer ends, and she insists that she be discharged, to which Ezra kind of relents. He recognizes that, yeah, okay, we need to have some haste, and he promises to file for Spathadia's discharge ASAP. However, he wishes to follow her in order to continue to monitor her condition, to which Spathadia does take some exception, primarily because he is human. And again, this idea of human versus arcanist, the kind of rift between the two comes to the forefront. She says that she is grateful to him for what he's done. However, the Uluru Games are an arcanist event and no human has ever set foot in the stadium. And she doesn't want to allow him into the stadium because this is for arcanists, this is for them, and she doesn't really want to, I guess, taint the games with the presence of a human being. And now Ezra kind of insists, first of all, he needs to be there because she is still unwell, but also he wants to learn more about reincarnation, and the only way for him to do this is to follow Spathadia, and this definitely upsets her. She feels that she is being treated as, I guess, an experiment, but Ezra reiterates that he harbors no ill intent, he just wants to know more. However, Spathadia feels betrayed and continues to refute him. And it's at this point that we get a sort of convergence of our motives for wanting to bring back the Uluru Games, right? Obviously, Spathadia wants to bring them back because of her previous lives' affiliation with them, right? And Vertin and Ezra because they both just want to help Spathadia for different reasons, kind of, but they do both want to help her. Desert Flannel because she can make money off of it now, and McCower because he wants to screw over Desert Flannel. So all the pieces are kind of set. We kind of get this idea of why everyone's doing the things they're doing, and it's at this point that we can sort of get into the story proper of actually getting the games into, full swing, getting things underway. Chapter 6 rolls around, and we have now shifted to a desert where Vertin, Desert Flannel, and Spathadia have all traveled in order to find the location of the Uluru Stadium. Notably, Ezra is not present as Spathadia has remained firm in her rejection of him, And after wandering around for a little bit, Spathodia's flame becomes active and shoots off in a direction, prompting all of the Arcanists to run off to follow it. When the coast is clear, Ezra pops out from behind a tree, revealing that he has actually been following them the entire time. Also, it's not super pertinent, but everyone still thinks Ezra is a girl at this point. The flame continues to race across the desert, leading them to a cave in which they find these ancient carvings just kind of plastered all over the wall, with Spathodia seemingly wildly entranced by the carvings. And while Vertin and Desert Final examine them, trying to find like the meaning behind them, Spathodia disappears. She just sort of wanders off and they don't know where she's gone. We now switch points of view to Spathodia, who is now fully in this trance, and she is now in this dark void of space, right? She begins to feel that intense thirst that she had felt when she first spat up the fire, and a flame lights up the dark, and she begins to converse with it. She finds that in her past life as a reincarnator, she and this flame had known each other before, kind of getting into a bit of a scuffle and a rift forming in their relationship. She begins to see these images of her past life, of her playing a game that she refers to as Malingi's Harvest, of her reaching into the fire and pulling out this particular flame, and this oath that she makes towards the Uluru games and to herself, right? And at the end of all of this, she has retrieved the memories of her past life, a girl known as Flammy. However, rather than having her current personality subsumed as Ezra had originally posited, she seems to have retained her current persona, and she kind of chalks this up to the compatibility in both of her versions natures, as well as them shouldering the same burden of upholding the games. When she properly comes to, we find now that she is at the entrance to the stadium, and she is assaulted by the guardians of the stadium, and too tired to fight them, she begins to panic. However, Vertin and Desert Final and Ezra all appear in the nick of time, and they all fight. And upon defeating the guardians, the gates to the Uluru Stadium finally reveals themselves, right? A great plume of steam erupts, and as it clears, we see that the flame that has been following Spathodia around has now kind of evolved into this more humanoid form and is now able to speak to all of them. To which both the flame and Spathodia invite the group into the Uluru Stadium. The Arcanist step through. However, Ezra hesitates. He recognizes that he has followed Spathodia here against her wishes, and that he probably shouldn't enter if she doesn't wish for it. However, Spathodia now has a new outlook and saying that the gate has appeared before him, therefore he is permitted to enter. She recognizes all of the things that he has done to help her, and it seems for a moment that her resentment of humans is somewhat abated at this point, and they have somewhat reconciled. Yeah. So they all enter the stadium, and immediately all of the Arcanists are hit with this feeling of invigoration, referring to it as comfortable and pleasing. However, Ezra doesn't really feel anything at all. The flame, Ulu, is over 1,000 years old, and she kind of takes them on a little tour of the stadium, and Spathodia becomes kind of angry upon realizing that the games and the stadium have been somewhat altered, and that humans have kind of had their influences felt here as well, and she chides Ulu for not being more upset about it. To which Ulu says, she's an old flame now, and that it takes more than just that to make her, fly off the handle. Spathodia is still a bit angry, but she decides to shelve it for now, saying that they're in the stadium, they ought to play the Arcanist games. To which Desert Flannel asks her where they expect to find a whole bunch of Arcanists. And Vertin pulls out her suitcase and just starts, pulling people out of it. a bunch of Arcanists pop out of the suitcase, and swiftly some impromptu games are commenced. And for the most part, it's pretty much just fluff, right? It's just fun times. We get some cameos of Arcanists that we haven't officially met yet in the main story or in side stories. And for the most part, it's just, you could say filler, I suppose. However, we do get some relevance to the primary plot of the game. And this is when Regulus stops and mentions that the stadium smells kind of weird. And she says that she has smelled this before in the cave in Apiron. Now, this tells us two things. First of all, it confirms the timeline, right? It tells us that this takes place definitely after Chapter 5, which we already knew, but now we have it, like, in writing, right? And it also tells us that the stadium is affected by this asymmetric nuclide R that was in the cave and that was allegedly existing around the spinning wheel in the suitcase. So this is the Uluru Stadium is a point that is safe from the storm, essentially. And we kind of get these similar symptoms of asymmetric nuclide R, which is that it kind of induces this manic or trance-like state in an Arcanist for a period of time before ultimately causing them to pass out. We saw this with Regulus in the cave, where she sees the giant planet or moon rise up and then she promptly passes out. It's almost narcotic in nature, causing a state of inebriation almost. And we recognize that this might become a problem as Spathadia passes out after participating in some games, and the tone starts to shift because other Arcanists begin to be affected by this atmosphere as well and are beginning to pass out. Regulus thinks that Ulu is a giant version of Apple and attempts to hug her and gets burned, and Ulu becomes excited with all of the general hubbub and commotion and begins to blaze out of control, which leaves us to extinguish her essentially so that she doesn't just burn the place to the ground. Ezra then realizes that prolonged activity within the stadium will have a negative effect on Arcanists, and they must evacuate, to which everyone retreats to the suitcase. Chapter 9 is mostly just bureaucracy simulator, right? So we're just going to breeze through the main points. All the Arcanists have been evacuated to the suitcase. Spathadia is out for a while, but she does eventually come to, and she insists that she goes to City Hall in order to get proper permission and paperwork filed for the Uluru games, make everything official. Ezra refuses for a little bit, but then relents, saying that, yeah, there's no way he's going to keep her there, so he might as well follow her. At City Hall, they have issues. Desert Flannel and Spathadia just cannot make heads or tails of the paperwork, and eventually Ezra agrees to help them out. They also strike a deal with Laplace, who agree to lend aid in repairing the stadium. However, Spathadia puts forth the condition that the internals of the stadium should remain untouched. And that's basically it for Chapter 9. In Chapter 10, we get a whole bunch more of the repair work and all of the logistics and renovations and all of that stuff. However, we also get notice that they will need to repair the internal walls and ceiling, which directly contradicts the condition that Spathadia had set up beforehand. To which, of course, she becomes angry, as this was not part of the deal. And this begins to open up a rift between Spathadia and Ezra, because again, humans have done something that she is not particularly happy about. She feels as if these things that are reserved for Arcanists, these things that belong specifically to Arcanists, are being tainted and changed from the thing that they should be into something that humans want them to be. Now, Ezra does actually push back a little this time, because while Spathadia is relatively unconcerned about the safety issues, saying that Arcanists can just, get out of the way, use their Arcanum to protect themselves, etc., etc., Ezra is more concerned about the human attendees of the event, because if something were to go wrong, if like something were to collapse or whatever, they would not necessarily have the means to escape as easily as Arcanist. So he is more concerned about the, I suppose, overall safety measures being taken to make sure everybody is safe rather than just Arcanist. And to this, Spathodea is surprised because she wonders why would there be why would there be humans in the stadium? And we find out now that she is still pretty steadfast in her idea that the games are for Arcanists and that humans shouldn't be allowed in, and that Ezra is more of an exception rather than what the expectation was to be, because she considers Ezra to be a kind human, the one who would help someone else regardless of their race or their standing, I suppose. And Ezra refutes this. He says, "I am no greater than any other human." He's trying to drive home the point that Spathodea's dislike of humans, while not necessarily unfounded, does need to be examined a little bit, because she's maybe looking at this through a bitter lens. But this kind of falls on deaf ears. While Ezra is still trying to find a common ground for everyone, Spathodea is very, very, very resolute in her idea of, this is for Arcanist, I want this to be for Arcanist, and then she storms off. And then Ezra storms off, and the group for a little bit starts to fall apart. And it's kind of up to Burton, Desert Flannel, and Ulu to hold things together while everything sort of settles down, right? And after the group, or at least what remains of the group, convenes for the night, we find out that a bunyip has been listening in on them, and it reports back to Macawer. It's now confirmed that he has been in league with the bunyips, cooperating with them, and they are currently feeding him information, which is how he's known about all of their events, how he's been able to publish all of these papers regarding the things they've been doing so far. We go to chapter 11, and the scene shifts once more, this time to a rugby stadium. Desert Flannel has taken Ezra to a game in order to show him what the world looks like from an Arcanist point of view. Now, it's here that we get some more insight on the more tangible differences between Arcanists and humans. Up till now, we've had mostly differences in philosophy or their the way they think. Arcanists are allegedly more irrational, that sort of thing. However, now we get something that's a bit more solid, right? We learn that Arcanists are typically not as robust and not as physically strong as humans. Humans are generally considered to be the more physically powerful of the two, right? However, Arcanists have this tendency to heal much quicker than humans. As Desert Flannel puts it, it only takes 15 minutes to fix up an Arcanist, and they will take painkillers and enter him, and this allows them to be more aggressive on the court and allows them to ignore most injuries that would sideline a regular human. And this is kind of how, at least in the sporting world, Arcanists are able to keep pace with humans who are stronger. They just kind of muscle through the pain and just grit their teeth and bear it. And we find out that this is not necessarily the best thing for them yet, because it starts to take a little bit of a darker turn at this point. We learn that Arcanists in especially sporting events are more likely to build up injuries that last over a long term, like chronic repeat injuries. They tend to develop addictions to painkillers, prone to overdose. Basically everything that they do to keep up with the humans is slowly destroying them from inside, right? And while humans have this natural advantage, Arcanists are forced to resort to these methods in order to keep pace with them. And now Ezra starts to see Spathodea's point of view a little bit, because if this is what Arcanists are subject to on the human side of things, it kind of makes sense that she would want something just for Arcanists, something where they can all play on an even playing field. And then Macawer shows up again, because of course he does. He tries to do the paparazzi thing, to which Desert Flannel isn't really having it. So we get in a bit of a fight, we kind of fend them off, and then we run away. And this whole group of reporters, along with Macawer, are sort of just chase us. And that's where the chapter ends. We cut now to chapter 12, where we are with Spathodea, who has already begun to regret the things she said. She recognizes that she was being unfair and that not all humans are bad, and she was kind of just letting her judgment cloud her good rational thought, right? She recognizes that she should probably apologize to Ezra since this was kind of instigated by her. And to this, Ulu kind of reminisces. She reminds Spathadia of what had happened in her past life as Flammy. Now, Spathadia as Flammy and Ulu are the ones who kind of progenited the Uluru games, right? They are the reason it exists, and at some point they have this very trivial argument over who contributed more to the games. Yet this winds up blowing up and they stop talking for several days. However, when they were deciding to reconcile, Flammy winds up getting bitten by a snake and then eventually dying. And Ulu kind of expresses this regret. She after thousands of years is very regretful that Flammy never got to grow up, that they never got to have that reconciliation or, come together again. So the fact that Spathadia is here now in the same shoes is kind of, it's kind of cathartic for her, right? And Spathadia, upon hearing this, decides that she doesn't really want to make those same mistakes again, and that she wants to get up and reconcile with Ezra, to which conveniently both Ezra and Desert Flannel show up, and they are still being chased by the paparazzi. With, of course, Macaur in the lead, right? And he shows up, he tries to stir up some heat again, trying to get them to say something stupid, to which Verton's contact in Australia appears, Slouch Hat. Now, this guy is mentioned a few times in the story prior. I didn't really mention him here just because it wasn't really pertinent, but now the man actually shows up, and we find out that he is a literal hat. He's just a floating hat. And I'm a bit not sure about what his deal is. He could be an awakened. He could just be an arcanist, kind of like Apple or Darley Clatter, in that they are arcanists, but they're very much not human. Or he could be like a knight, who is... I'm not sure what a knight's deal is either, actually. I don't know if it's a ghost wearing the armor or if it's just, the armor animated. The point is, he shows up, and he fields all of the reporters' questions and basically manages to chase Macaur off. Again, because Macaur is a coward. In chapter 13, we get a bit of a time skip, around 2 weeks to when the renovations have completed and the games are almost ready to commence. Spathadia is setting up, making sure everything's in order when she is interrupted by Ezra showing up. And we find out at this point that they have kind of set aside their differences to some degree. However, there is still some lingering tension, some lingering awkwardness, right? But that's not the important part, because right now there is a problem at the gates. Spathadia goes up front and finds that there is just this whole group of people waiting outside in the desert, and that Macaur has brought all of them. We find out that Macaur has sold tickets to all of these people in order to garner this large crowd for the games, and then has led them in circles in the desert in order to exhaust them and make them more volatile. So now we basically have an angry mob on our hands who are irate, calling for water, demanding entry into the games. So this has been kind of Macaur's plan all along, to, I guess, overload us with just people and things hoping to overwhelm us, right? However, Spathadia gets up and she's able to confront the crowd, to which Macaur puts her on the spot, right? He says that she is supposedly supposed to be the bridge between human and arcanist, that she is supposed to be kind of this ideal of coexistence. And then he reveals the footage that he has of Spathadia getting angry, right? Of her saying very anti-human things, of her saying that humans will never be allowed in the stadium. All of these things that she now recognizes as not reasonable, he is revealing to the crowd. And asks her point blank that if she is supposed to be this beacon of coexistence, why she has these feelings. And this causes the crowd to rile up a little bit. And it's at this point that Macaur's bunyip, the one that's been feeding him the information, comes out. It's been feeding on the atmosphere and the negativity and all the gossip in the area, and it eventually grows to monstrous proportions, and we are forced to fight it, which is what the final boss fight in this event is, right? It's just this evolved bunyip. Now, Spathadia keeps her cool. she confronts the accusations directly, right? First, there is the accusation of arson at the Laplace clinic, to which Spathadia admits, yeah, it happened, but it was accidental, it was already paid for, amends were already made. He then addresses the crowds waiting at the gate, how they have been exhausted and demand entry, and she says, yeah, but the tickets they were sold were fake. Clearly, like, you can see that the local gangs have sort of instigated this. However, there is a solution that she is able to come up with that would allow them all into the games and kind of assuage all of their worries. And to this, Macaur pulls out his trump card. How does Spathadia plead to all of the anti-human allegations? And she doesn't. She recognizes that she has said these words. She has thought these thoughts before. She recognizes that the folly in her own ideas and her own, preconceptions. She accepts that there are good and kind humans, and the reason that she was even able to get to this point with the games was because humans had helped. As Ulu says, confront it, light it up, conquer it, and make it burn for you. She takes this situation that is very bad for her and kind of turns it on its head, right? She makes it burn for her. She recognizes that she was wrong and that people are not beyond basically redemption. They can always choose to change the way she has chosen to change. So she apologized to everyone, says everyone is welcome, and allows them in. To which Macaur now realizes that he has been beat. He attempts to flee, but is stopped by Vertin, Desert Flannel, and Ezra, and is basically, his plans have basically come to an end here. And now, with all of the antagonists taken care of, with all of the problems and the issues and what have you resolved, the games are now free to finally commence, right? And it begins with Spathadia running Ulu up to light the flame in a little torch, right? As she's running, Ulu has this very poignant moment of catharsis, of her finally recognizing and expressing her joy that Flammy was finally able to grow up and live her life, and that Spathadia is now more than just Flammy. She is this person who has basically managed to make something for herself, who has basically managed to surpass what she had been years and years and years ago in the past, right? And this causes Ulu to begin crying, and upon crying, her flames start to peter out, which startles Spathadia, who trips, and everyone gasps because the torch is on the ground, the fire looks like it's about to go out, and once the flame just seems about done, Ezra jumps out to carry the torch. And he helps Spathadia up, and the flame of the Uluru games is lit by the joint hands of the humans and the arcanists. Which I think is a very fitting end to this whole story, right? It ties up all of the major conflicts and plot points that we have been introduced to so far. And with that, the story has basically come to an end. We do have chapter 15, where we attempt to tie up all of the loose ends and bring a nice conclusion to this whole thing. We learn more about Macaur and Desert Flannel's beef, and as expected, it is something so wildly trivial, and it fits Macaur, because just like him, it doesn't matter, right? Desert Flannel was once commissioned to take a photograph of a very rare creature, a pink torch hummingbird. However, what she saw was a pink platypus and took a picture of that instead. And then she gave that to a children's magazine and they published it everywhere. We then find out that Macaur was that platypus. He had taken a transformation potion for whatever reason, and upon having his picture taken and disseminated to the world, has now become humiliated and as a result swore vengeance on Desert Flannel. Now, this doesn't make any goddamn sense, right? Because first of all, he's a pink platypus at this point. How is anybody gonna know who the hell that is? He's not that important, right? And he's a platypus. No one's gonna know. Yet somehow he has managed to take this whole, very, I wouldn't say trivial, okay? But it's not that big of a deal. And he takes it and turns it into this lifelong grudge and this desire to destroy Desert Flannel at any cost. And that's just been what's fueling him this entire time. And to me, it's a very, very weak motive for a character that's very, very weak, right? Like I said, Macawer feels more like a plot tool than an actual character. He is just there to stir shit up. He is just there because he can be, and because he is the most expedient way of getting plot points across. And honestly, I'm not too fond of that. In terms of the story, I think he could have been, I don't know, he didn't need to be a fully fleshed out character, right? But he could have at least just been a bit more in depth than he currently is. Yeah? In any case, after the games, Desert Flannel collected as many of the copies of the magazine and the photo that was taken, and took Macawer aside and burned all of the copies for him. To which he breaks down crying, right? Some of this is thrown into question as Spathody and Ezra don't really seem to believe that this is the ending. However, that's what we get. So, again, a very mediocre conclusion to a very mediocre character. We then shift over to Burton, who gives us a bit more information on the stadium, and it is confirmed the stadium is very much like the Foundation and like a Puron, which makes it a potential target for Manus Vindictae. And to this end, the Foundation has deployed various people known as the Uluru Guardians, which are made out of 31 Arcanists and 29 humans from various fields of study and expertise, and they are here to make sure that the Uluru Stadium does not fall into Manus Vindictae's hands, right? And the whole event ends with the rock that contains the oath of the Uluru Games, the final words. No matter how many times the storm reshapes the world from top to bottom, no matter how the times or the lifestyle change, no matter how ignorant people become, whenever they open the gate to the Uluru Stadium again, they will remember the spirit and the faith it has been conveying. Things will change in the unstoppable river of time, yet the Uluru Stadium shall remain forever. And that is the story. Final thoughts? I thought it was fine, right? It was nothing groundbreaking, it was nothing amazing. We didn't get any super huge revelations about the nature of the game or the story or anything like that, which honestly I think it's fine. A chapter to decompress after a very heavy previous chapter I think is warranted. I didn't really have any problems with the story. It was a coherent plot, if somewhat simple. One thing I did find kind of surprising was how much Arcanists were accepted at this point. Granted, it does take place in 1991. However, at this point, we're seeing that Arcanists are now welcomed alongside like human athletes. They're allowed to participate alongside them, albeit with some very heavy like detriments to their health and stuff like that, right? I thought that was very interesting compared to like our previous events and our previous story stuff, where just being an Arcanist would have you just immediately ostracized, right? So the fact that the mood towards them has shifted so much, like there's still discrimination, but the fact that they're being like more accepted now really surprised me. I thought that was very interesting. In terms of Spathodia's character, I know some people were very much not happy with her, especially of the way that she treats Ezra, the way that she kind of blatantly disregards humans as a whole. Honestly, I think it's fine. I think it makes for a good path of development for the character, and I do think it's a little bit realistic, right? Because this is first of all, a teenager, who has been going through this very rough time of trying to compete in this space where she is naturally at a disadvantage, right? She has lived this experience and now has this feeling that the one thing that is specifically reserved for her is now being stripped away. I can kind of see why she would react the way that she did at first. It is kind of unreasonable, yes, but it is a very natural, I think, instinctive reaction to something like that. So honestly, not too bothered about Spathodia's character. I think she developed perfectly well. In terms of Ezra's character, we don't get a whole lot about him, do we? Everything about Ezra, both in the story, in even his kit, right, and even in his like side story, none of it is specifically about him. It is him popping up other people, if that makes sense, right? His whole existence within the story just seems to be making other people shine, which I think is an interesting way to display his character, because it does tell us about him, just not in any direct measure. I thought it was a very interesting thing. I don't really have too many opinions about Ezra besides the basic. I think he's a good kid, right? Because he was written that way. My only real complaint here was Macawer. I've already griped about this man so much, but they really could have done so much better with him because he was barely a character. He was there to cause problems, and that's about it. But I'm not gonna get back into that again. But with that, that is the end of the video. Remember how at the start I said this would probably be a shorter video? I think we are about hitting an hour. I don't know, I'll have to check in editing, but yeah, this was definitely not a shorter video. By the time this comes out, 1.6 will have dropped. So hopefully I can get that one out faster than I did this one, because this was super late. I was really hoping to get this out weeks ago, but I've been putting it off. But if you stuck around this long, thank you so much for watching. And I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you on the next one. Goodbye.